Hello, my name is Otto Scharmer. I'm an action researcher at MIT and the Presencing Institute. And I am sorry that I can't be with you in person next week. I'm taping this session on the Friday afternoon prior to your conference. I would have loved to join that, but I had earlier commitments here at MIT. So Susanne asked me to maybe share a few remarks and a few reflections on the topic of the creative university and the creative economy. So I will share that a little bit. I hope that's a little bit of useful for you guys, and I hope to learn from what will be emerging kind of from your conference next week, hopefully soon, and then reconnect with that conversation going forward. So a few remarks. The first one is talking about reinventing or changing the university. We all probably have been in this conversation way too often, I would say, way too often without any tangible impact. The university, a more than 1,000-year-old institution, in spite of all these conversations about change, we still kind of transfer knowledge through lectures as if the book printing technology has not yet been invented, and so on and so forth. So we have seen structural reforms, as we all know, but what we probably have not seen enough of is a reinvention, really, or a reshaping or regeneration of the essence and of the idea of the university. And if we track the evolution of the idea of the university, which then should drive kind of the evolution of the structure of the university, the first phase, I would say the last 1,000 years, it's probably like 3 or so phases, and currently maybe we are moving into a fourth one. The first one is really that the core idea of the university is the unity of teaching. It's really the unity of dogma, and kind of the dogma-based transfer of kind of religious knowledge or of church-based belief systems and knowledge. That's the first one. And then the second phase is moving from that to the unity of research and teaching, which is kind of the Humboldt type of revolution or renewal of the university or the idea of the university. And we have seen many positive things coming from that. And then probably what we have been seeing throughout the 20th century is a third stage that's based on the unity of teaching, research, and practice, making it much more kind of linking, geared towards serving practical needs in society. Those have been, I think, the three main stages in the evolution of the idea of the university. And what's happening now, I believe, is that we are moving into a fourth one, which could be called the unity of research, teaching, and transformative practice. So it's not only kind of serving the needs of largely dysfunctional institutions in society, but really putting the students, the learners, into the driver's seat of renewing societal institutions from the ground, basically reinventing the fundamental ways how we live and work together, reinventing kind of how we develop and evolve our institutions from scratch. And that's, I believe, what's happening kind of in our historical moment, kind of where we live in a moment of disruptive change, where we basically are running our civilizations with a set of institutions of living and working together that's hitting the wall, and that is inviting us, challenging us, kind of evoking us to reinvent the core institutions of business, of government, of politics, of democracy, and of course of education. So that's the moment we are in, and just to give that a little kind of more concrete example or data point, I know we all bring kind of different data points into this conversation, but here's one kind of that comes from MIT, the place that I have spent my the better part of the last 2 decades in. Last year or so, the new MIT president challenged all of us to fundamentally reinvent how we basically do our research and do our teaching and do our kind of practical engagements in society. And one part of that challenge, of course, is the disruptive moment that we live in terms of online learning. MIT, through its commitment to open source with OCW, that has like 2 million users a month, where we put all course curriculums online for all educators. That started, I don't know, like 5-7 years ago. Now made a second commitment to basically, create kind of online, put all kind of learning infrastructures online and make it available for free for everyone. That initiative was joined by Harvard University, and it's first it was called MITx, now it's edX. It has been joined by 29 or so additional universities worldwide. I'm sure kind of many of you are also connected with that. And in our case, it means like MIT used to be a relatively small university with 9,000 students here in Cambridge. And that's kind of what was the main focus of teaching and learning and the educational activity. But with edX, kind of with the online learning revolution moving forward, not only there will be a completely different business model, because the online learning model basically operates for free. Kind of it's a radical democratization of learning, making broadening the access to this educational content in a very significant way. But also it means that MIT, or kind of the learning content, the learning curricula developed here in the future could not only be relevant for 9,000 students here in Cambridge, but for millions, hundreds of millions, billions, potentially billions of users, basically radically democratizing kind of the access of education. So what the challenge was of the president, of the MIT president, is if we are kind of trying to be at the forefront of that development, really kind of making education an open source commons that is cultivated from many education institutions together, then what does it mean for the way we teach and learn and create learning environments on campus? So it's and if you think about that, kind of institutions like MIT or Harvard, they could easily go on for another decade or so with defending the old business model and the old learning model, and they wouldn't suffer too much. But kind of really being at the forefront of this radical democratization of education, that really is something that personally inspires me, is one of the reasons why I'm still here. And of course, if you double click on the MOOCs, kind of the massive open online courses that everyone is working on, then there has been something, there has been quite a hype and something that has been working well. Kind of you bring in 50,000, 60,000 or so students, but then the follow through is somewhat disappointing. Kind of just 10% or less following through. And also, if you really look at what is the knowledge being transferred there, it's usually just technical knowledge, and so the practical knowledge much less, and transformative knowledge or leadership knowledge or self-knowledge not yet. So that's not yet. It's basically a learning environment where you're alone with your computer and where something, the community dimension and the deeper learning dimension and the transformative dimension and the mindfulness dimension, all of that is missing. What excites me most really these days is that I am working I got the possibility and with that I'm only the second faculty member at the Sloan School of Management, to be able to create a MOOC around my class here at Sloan School of Management, and that MITx and edX really give me all freedom to radically innovate and change and disrupt really the existing model of online learning by adding live sessions where we have global mindfulness practices with the global community of learners across all cultures, by adding small cohorts of learning circles where you can practice deep listening and transformative coaching in groups of 5 with the presencing coaching model, where you have each week a tool that you apply in local contexts, where you have reflection groups, and where you then during the course develop your own prototype initiatives that allows you to not only sense but also actualize your own entrepreneurial community, and where then we will create platforms and spaces for the global community of change makers to become aware of itself. And one thing that we learned with online learning methodologies with the Presencing Institute in the past is just the simple fact of bringing together such a globally diverse groups of learners and entrepreneurs and change makers in the same moment, and using mindfulness practices to really become aware of yourself, of the earth, of the situation, and of everyone else in that community, is an incredibly inspiring and empowering experience in itself. So there's a bunch of things that we are going to try. Not all of that will work, but I'm just, I guess, sharing my own enthusiasm for the current moment of disruption, not that we experience not only in our society, but also in our in the space of education, in evolving and disrupting the evolution of universities. So I have a lot of energy for that, and that's a long way of saying that I would love to stay in the conversation with you guys. And I thought I share a little bit with you. So what is my way into this space, the last few years, and then talk a little bit about some ongoing activities of change that relate to the conference of the topic of your conference, which is the transformation of the economy, of the self, the learning space of the university, and also of the development model that our societies and our economies are operating on. So maybe a few words to my own story, to my own context. I did my PhD I don't know how long, that must have been some 20 years ago or so, at a German university, Wittenherdecke University. The topic was of my thesis was reflective modernization of capitalism as a revolution from within. Yes, no one really could connect with that a lot. So, but that was not the worst thing about it. The worst thing was maybe that I realized that I could talk about stuff like learning societies and so on, but and I could produce thick books, more or less unreadable on that topic, and papers. But what I also noticed is that the knowledge that I created on that topic was completely useless for the change makers in the field, for the very persons and actors that actually are at the forefront of these developments that I try to describe focus my research on. So that question, which is how could I develop a knowledge that's actually more helpful, more transformative, more useful, kind of for people who are at the forefront of these developments, that question brought me here to Cambridge, to MIT, to Boston. I back then joined the MIT Learning Center, and as some of you may remember, back then Peter Senge just had published kind of the fifth discipline, the art and practice of organizational learning. With that book, he didn't really invent kind of organizational learning. That happened earlier through other people, but he made it popular, and he really was the one who brought that topic into the boardroom of management across institutions and sectors and cultures. So what attracted me is here in Cambridge is the tradition of action research, which, as we all know, kind of starts with Kurt Lewin's dictum, which is that you cannot understand a system unless you change it. So that kind of approach, that as a researcher you need to get beyond observation, you need to get involved and kind of in the learning by doing and the researching by doing, gives you actually a deeper access to the deeper layers of knowledge, not just third-person knowledge, but also second and first-person knowledge. That is actually very relevant to what we try to understand in the issue of social, personal, and institutional transformation. So that brought me here, and and then I never managed to move on. I mean, that's basically the story. And if I now look back on the past 20 years and ask myself, okay, what is it that I really learned, if anything, then I would say one thing that I learned, or one distinction kind of that clarified for me over the years, is that there are two different sources of learning, and accordingly two different learning cycles that are applied in organizational and institutional and in social learning processes. One is learning by reflecting on the past, on the experiences of the past. And you can go through all the major existing organizational learning theories, Argyris, Schoen, Schein, Senge, and so on and so forth. And they're all, based on the same learning model, which is the experiential learning model, which basically makes you reflect on the experiences that you have had, kind of the experience of the past. However, in working with leadership teams in business, government, civil society, and so on, I realized that more often than not, leaders and leadership team face challenges that you cannot successfully address just by reflecting on the experience of the past. Sometimes the past is not very helpful. Sometimes the experience of the past is the very obstacle that prevents a team to come up with a new way of framing. So noticing that, realizing that, awakened this question in my mind, which is there a second source of learning? And if yes, how does it work? And I interviewed then, that put me on a path of interviewing 150 practitioners and, folks who created something really new in business, in technology, in science, in society, in the creative arts. And what I realized is, if you listen to the deeper subtext of these stories, they were not talking about this other learning process that I just cited before. They were operating on a different learning cycle that I would describe as learning from the future as it emerges. So, learning by sensing and actualizing emerging future possibilities. And while the first process, learning by reflecting on the past, is mainly kind of centering and revolving around your reflective capacities that reside above your neck, sensing and actualizing emerging future possibility requires you to, in addition to this, also access other sources of knowing. The knowing of the heart, and the knowing kind of something that I call kind of the open heart, and the knowing of our deeper sense of who we really are, something that I refer to as will or as open will. And that requires us kind of to let go of the old and to tune into that what is wanting to emerge through us. Now, realizing that then put me on a path of inquiring how, so if that's like this other process of learning from the future as it emerges, something that I began to call, I realized kind of there is no real good word for that. And yet it is a fundamental process that is at the essence of what it means to thrive in the 21st century. Because this century is marked by disruptions. And whenever a disruption hits, so the more we live in disruptive environments, the more important this type of learning is, which is discontinuing the past and tuning into emerging future possibilities. So when I realized that, I started to become interested in what does it take for individuals, for teams, for organizations, and for really larger systems to access this deeper source of knowing and this deeper source of renewal. So that basically has been my journey. I have been exploring kind of then the social technology, kind of the methods and tools kind of that support this kind of process in many projects across sectors and across cultures. And I started, first it was more on the organizational level, and then I started to realize kind of where really the biggest societal problems are is really in the cross-sector innovation. So I have been doing, these renewal and innovation and change processes in education, sustainability, health, business, and if I look at the deeper themes, if I look at the commonalities and differences, I would say from a leadership perspective, all these very different systems basically face us with the same leadership challenge. And the same leadership challenge is that in all these systems, the leadership challenge boils down to bringing together a very diverse group of stakeholders that currently work in a more or less dysfunctional way that is characterized by operating each on their own kind of ecosystem awareness and moving them through a process that makes them aware of each other, of the larger system, and also of their own deeper intentions. And that helps them to move from their ecosystem awareness to something that I call ecosystem awareness, by which I mean in an awareness that not only focuses on my own well-being, but also on the well-being of all the other actors in the system, kind of on the well-being of the whole. So what I learned is that this is actually a very natural process. You actually can do that. You can do that by going on an external learning journey, but also on an inner learning journey that requires us to use methods and tools kind of to open up not only the mind, but also the heart and the will. And to practice that and kind of to be helpers for each other, kind of in this kind of deeper leadership work and this deeper cultivation work. So basically what I'm saying here is that as we see today, like in places like Davos and many other places where I have seen it, that kind of the usefulness of mindfulness practices for the individual is quickly catching on and is like evident to many leaders in major institutions today. What is not catching on are the dysfunctional collective practices, the collective sleepwalking that we are engaged in by collectively producing results that nobody wants. So where I see the challenge and where I see really the future task of the university is to equip people with methods and tools that not only kind of on an individual level help us to become more mindful, more compassionate, and so on and so forth. But where we learn methods and tools that help us to develop these capacities of mindfulness and compassion, and acting from a shared awareness, also on a collective level. So that's really where I see the main task, and where I also try to focus on in my research and my the contributions kind of that my colleagues and I kind of can bring here from MIT and the Presencing Institute. So that's a little bit kind of the journey kind of on a higher conceptual level. So in the more recent years, I shifted from working with individual organizations, which I still do, but more to really creating these cross-sector platforms, kind of focusing on where collaboration and capacity building is needed most. And that's on a collective level, the system-wide level, that brings together key stakeholders across all three sectors: business, government, civil society, and kind of creates an environment for them to go through that journey that I just described. And those are kind of very specific constellation of players. It's basically the players that need each other in order to innovate at the scale of the whole system. And that's kind of one set of players in education. It's another set of players in health. It's another set of players in business and sustainability and so forth. So that's what I'm trying to do. And I thought, probably my time is almost up. Let me just check here. What I thought I could do in the end is kind of maybe give a few kind of ongoing examples, which is all like a work in progress. And that probably is then a good kickoff for you guys when you move kind of from this initial remarks that I'm doing here into probably talking in small groups about your own experiences and stories kind of that you bring into this conversation in the context that we are discussing here right now and that you are discussing at the conference. So let me then maybe just mention 2 or 3 quick small examples. The first one is just this week. I spent the first 2 days this week in Washington, D.C. at the World Bank with an initiative that is focusing on creating collective action platforms. And if you look at the transformation of the World Bank and the restructuring and refocusing that they are going on, I don't want to get lost in the details here, but the bottom line is kind of a refocusing on some of basically abolishing kind of extreme poverty and creating shared prosperity. And if you really can then look at that bigger picture, one thing is very, very clear, which is, hey, with our old mechanisms of change, we will be not getting there anytime in this century. So what we need to do is to move on from the old banking practices by creating change through lending money to one that's kind of brings in much more kind of the knowledge dimension, and also much more the dimension of convening platforms for collaboration and co-creation, basically crowding in many other players kind of that, along with the World Bank, who also does a little bit of useful things, then kind of engage in collective action towards the key challenges that the respective host country is facing, and not only the government there, but also engaging the community, civil society sector, and the business community. So that's the challenge, and that's why. So in other words, kind of even the World Bank is realizing that the only way of accomplishing the impact that we aspire to have is by crowding in many other players and partners and creating kind of platforms for collective action. How to do that, what are best practices, how can that capacity be cultivated, that was the topic there. And of course, I'm not talking yet about something that's already mainstream, but it's like, I think it's a symptom kind of that these conversations happening, and at least that there are significant minorities in these institutions that try to make this work because they believe in that and they have the same heart and mind and work in that as we have. So that's one little example. And another example that comes to my mind is when I first started there must have been it's already like 8 years ago or something. When I first started, when I realized, hey, I'm doing all these organization projects, but the real problems in society are really across organizations and sectors, and that's where we needed to focus on. So I went around and talked to a list of the list of players and the institutions basically that Peter Peter Senge and or I had been working with. So I went around and asked them, okay, so would you give kind of your, the next generation leaders, kind of people who would be in 5 years or so in an executive board position, would you give them for 2-3 weeks a year into this kind of experimental platform, and we go on a learning journey, we do outer work, inner work, and then we engage in rapid cycle prototyping initiatives where they can, across sectors, business, government, civil society, engage in more co-creative ways of working together. So learning by doing. And almost all of them said yes. And so to cut a long story short, kind of people did their prototypes, and in the end there was profound personal transformation, there was profound relational transformation, even though some of the NGOs and businesses had initially kind of more antagonistic or hostile relationships. And there was really interesting prototypes. Some of them were more transformative and others less, as you can expect, kind of because that was just learning by doing. It was not designed. I never oversold or tried to even sell the impact of these prototypes. Now, what's so interesting about this group? So you could say, yeah, there was, some of those worked and some of them maybe less successful. That was the assessment at the end of this kind of experimental first type. What's so interesting about this group or this platform is that today, like 7 years on, the impact of these small little prototypes that started back then has magnified and multiplied many, many times. It's just amazing how to see how these kind of slow pace projects initially, not all of them, but several of them really took off. And now, for example, in Indonesia, we have like the 5th group who is, so that the country replicated this. There's a country platform for this type of learning. They come here to MIT once a year. And we are now kind of that whole ecosystem of change makers kind of that went through this process is now focusing on CTI, the Coral Triangle Initiative, which is the biggest, I think it's the biggest multi-stakeholder project on this planet right now, with many governments, businesses, civil society organizations. It's the second most important kind of biodiversity region on this planet. And there are many other. We work with the Chinese government now, as a replication from that, as a direct outcome from this initial one. There are projects in South Africa, in climate change labs in South Africa, in Indonesia. There are like networks of entrepreneurship, many things that got sparked by this initial network, and it's really to see how the midterm impact is so much higher than the short-term one on the tangible, but the intangible, kind of the transformation of the heart, the transformation of the relationship, that was very evident at the beginning. So I just give that as another example. I was surprised when I first went out that how genuinely people supported this idea. Although, frankly, I couldn't sell them anything useful for their companies. I wasn't even trying to make the promise that it would be short-term useful for them. And yet, people realize that as we move into this disruptive moment in history as a global community, that's exactly kind of creating these new platforms of learning is exactly what needs to happen. Last year, and that's maybe the last little story here before coming to a close. Last year, I, together with some colleagues, founded another project, a lab. We call it like a Global Wellbeing and G&H Lab. And it's focusing on transformation of business and society. And so it's a collaboration between the Presencing Institute, the G&H Center in Bhutan, and GIZ, the Global Leadership Academy at GIZ, which is what USAID is. My time is up. What USAID is for the United States, that's kind of the German equivalent for that. So it's the Development Corporation vehicle, and we brought together. So the concept was very simple. Realizing that, as you all know, kind of in developed countries, more GDP does not translate into more well-being. So then the question, and GDP is not a good indicator for economic progress. And the question is, well, what is it then? Kind of how can we have better indicators, more precise indicators for measuring economic progress, both in the global north and the global south? And we brought together like leaders in government. We had, for example, a governor and the first lady from a U.S. state, from Oregon. We had several CEOs. We had ministry people from Brazil, several participants from Bhutan, from India, and so SIVA, kind of the Self-Employed Women's Association, and other places. So a bunch of different change makers. We had a first deep dive in Brazil, looking at some examples there, and then a second one in Bhutan, and then learning about what's going on, but also kind of connecting with our own deeper sources of knowing. And then we basically asked people, okay, so after all of this, what are the sparks for action that have clarified for you? What can you take from what we have seen here, for example, in Bhutan, in terms of G&H and so forth? What's kind of the most interesting insight you got that you could bring home to your own institution, be that a business, a government, or a global NGO? And then that moved into the third stage, which is kind of multi-local prototyping. And it was really interesting, the initiatives that emerged from that. There's kind of a hub initiative in Brazil. There's in the United States kind of the it's not G&H, as you know, it's kind of GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicator. So from 2 years ago, 5 countries who experimented with that. Now it's up to 20, and several participants of our lab have been key players behind that development. And then on the business side, I thought it was most interesting how much people really were gravitating towards using personal transformation as a gateway for transforming business and realigning the purpose of business really with the larger purpose and well-being of society. So that's kind of another process in the making. We are currently discussing kind of the 2.0 version. We will be coming back to Bhutan, and we really aspire to create like a global network of initiatives around that and contribute or to co-create that together with others and to contribute to creating some sparks ourselves and communicating them so that others can create their own sparks. We'll be using kind of the MIT X MOOC that I mentioned earlier to also kind of communicate that to a broader audience, both inside institutions but also on a grassroots level. So what I mean, in closing, kind of what is kind of the idea? So I said kind of at the outset, kind of the idea of the 21st century university somehow is kind of the unity of research, teaching, and transformative practice. So what would that look like? And now kind of let me maybe kind of just end with my own thinking around that a little bit, and just to throw in kind of a few terms, and I'm sure kind of you have many of which already connect with initiatives that you have been working on. So at the core, I think I see the really the essence of the 21st century is what's going on here in the US is this. So there is the transfer of technical knowledge is being put into MOOCs. And the big discussion here is how to then evolve what's happening on campus. From simply transferring technical knowledge, which is the past, to something more transferring practical knowledge. And what I believe is that we have to take a third step, which is to include and to create really as a new foundation of the university activity, the development of transformation knowledge or self-knowledge. Self-knowledge and all transformation, all deeper learning and leadership knowledge really is about turning around the camera and not only studying what's going on in the world, but also really inquiring the two root questions of creativity, which are who is myself and what is my work, kind of. And when I say who is myself, I mean the self with a capital S, which is my highest future possibility. And when I talk about what is my work, I mean the capital W work, which is kind of my purpose, kind of my sense of source, why I'm here, what I try to make happen. And kind of on that, so if that's kind of the base, I think there are three core activities that I see, the university, the emerging university of the future engaged in. And one is like generating kind of knowledge for action, kind of across discipline. Kind of the second one is building collective capacity for transformation, individual and collective capacity, and that could be kind of this leadership journey that I just described, or other mechanisms, or through MOOCs or other mechanisms. And the third one is, and where kind of the main thing about the building collective capacity really is engaging, engaging all the different intelligences, kind of the open mind, the open heart, the open will, or whatever the framework is you're going to use for that. And then the third one is to co-creating innovation labs. So labs that address some of the huge issues and opportunities we face in society, and that really focus on transformative practice there. So the story that I shared with the Global Wellbeing Lab, so that's a small example where there's a lab bringing people together, putting them on a journey, and the focus is on making a practical contribution for addressing the issue of developing new indicators of economic process. How do we create and measure well-being for all? So that's like an example there. So those kind of are the three main activities that I see at the core of this emerging university of the future. And when you then kind of in the next level look at the operating principles, so let me just share 10 of them with you, and I'm sure kind of many of them you already deal with in your own practice, but kind of maybe that's kind of another kind of concrete jump-off point for your discussion in a few moments. So number one, kind of engaging all levels of systems, from micro to meso to macro to mundo, including the meta level. Number two, engaging all levels of intelligences, IQ, EQ, SQ, or kind of open mind, open heart, open will. Number three, systems thinking and dialogue. It's all about really kind of the capacity, developing the capacity of gauging kind of these diverse groups into real dialogue, which is processes of thinking together. Number 4, using MOOCs in a way kind of that really is awakening the deeper levels of entrepreneurship, kind of that's dormant in each kind of, and the deeper levels of creativity and entrepreneurship that's dormant in each and every human being, but that very often doesn't get nurtured or activated. Number 5, deep dive place-based learning journeys. So yes, we need online stuff, but we need kind of deep immersion. We need kind of we need to awaken kind of the senses, all the senses kind of the individuals, but also of the collective entities. And deep immersion journeys kind of are a key vehicle and principle kind of in these new learning environments. Number 6, Science 2.0, and with that I mean really activating and cultivating the capacity to connect with not only with third-person knowledge, but also second-person and first-person knowledge. Number 7, presencing, so developing the capacity of sensing and actualizing kind of the highest future possibility. That's a skill, it's a capacity. You need to see it, you need to practice it, it can be learned, it can be awakened. That's another core principle here. Number 8, the power of intention. Yes, we need to connect with reality, we need to get a shared awareness of reality, but we also need to connect kind of with our deeper intention, kind of that is kind of organizing our journey here on Earth. And again, that comes with a set of practices, with a set of tools and methods that are important to be made available for the next generation of change makers on this planet. And then number 9, multi-local prototyping, linking head, heart, and hand. So that is really to say that when you look at the practice of innovation, most of us learned the wrong stuff. Basically, it's all different versions, whether it's science or engineering and so on. Also, all different versions of analysis paralysis. What do you learn as a designer, kind of when you come from the creative arts, when you come from kind of, you learn the practice of rapid cycle prototyping to explore an idea by doing before you're done, before you figured out everything. That's another key principle. And number 10, and maybe most important, it's a global set of hubs, a global set of hotspots that cultivate this new learning space. And I thought about the 21st century university always as a globally distributed organism, kind of that resides in each of the major cultures that we have on Earth right now, and where we have like communities really coming together around these 3 core practices that I mentioned before, based on these principles that I just mentioned, and really cultivate kind of places of renewal, of kind of personal, relational, and institutional renewal in a way that looks a little bit different in each culture, and yet is aligned by a shared intention globally across these regions. And what I found interesting, I have been having this vision really forever. I mean, it's at the end of the Theory U book, which is, I don't know how many years ago, 10 years or so. And then it's at the end of the most recent book, The Leading from the Emerging Future. The vision didn't change. But what did change is that suddenly I look left and right, and then I look left and right, and I see all these hub initiatives popping up. So it's something that's already there, but we haven't wrapped our awareness around it. We haven't connected the dots. And I think now is the time to really connect the dots, to look at the bigger picture, and to become aware of kind of the enabling infrastructure that our emerging global movement requires. So, summing up, what I'm really talking about is to bring together to base the 21st century university by bringing together science, consciousness, and profound social renewal and innovation, profound institutional innovation. It's in that kind of triangle where really the interesting stuff happens, and that's really what has my commitment and my attention. And another way of putting that is so when we do that, what we do for the next generation of change makers is that we create a place that allows them to connect and to integrate the power of entrepreneurship, of which we have many examples around the world, and the power of the awakening intelligence of the heart. And by linking these two forces, I think we, and doing that in a science-based methodological way. And what does science mean? Science means we do it with a method. We do it with a method that gives us transparency around the process, and allows us to link our attention and our intention in a more conscious way. So if we do that, and if we kind of undergird and support that kind of with the method of science, kind of that includes third person, second person, first person knowledge, I think there is nothing that we couldn't do in just 2-3 decades. And that's exactly what's necessary now. So that's where my mind is, and also my heart, and I wish you all the best. I know that's also very much at the center of many friends and colleagues in Bhutan, and the networks that connect all of us. So thanks for listening to me, and I look forward to learning from what will be emerging from your next round of conversation and from the ideas you will be developing over the next few days. Thank you.